Russia's former transport minister has been found dead today, several hours after being fired by Vladimir Putin. Officials say the body was discovered inside his car in a Moscow suburb.
Starovoyt shot himself in a Moscow suburb following the announcement of his dismissal.
Roman Starovoyt, who had held the post for less than a year, was dismissed earlier on Monday amid escalating turmoil in Russia's transport sector.
On the morning of July 7th, 2025, former Minister of Transport of the Russian Federation and former governor of the Kursk region, Roman Starovoyt, was found dead in his own car shortly after news broke of a presidential decree removing him from his ministerial post. What is most astonishing is that some now claim Starovoyt's death occurred long before the decree was made public, perhaps even during the night from Saturday to Sunday, while Putin's decree appeared only in the afternoon on Monday. This raises the inevitable question: what really happened to Roman Starovoyt? Did he truly commit suicide, or was he helped to leave this world, perhaps after learning of Putin's decision to dismiss him? And why would the Russian president bother to officially dismiss someone who was already dead? Many might think that when I describe the Russian Federation as a mafia posing as a state, I am exaggerating, that it's a metaphor rather than reality. But the circumstances of Roman Starovoyt's death demonstrate precisely that this is the truth. What we are dealing with is a mafia that mimics the symbols of statehood, but actually operates by the rules of the criminal underworld. Roman Starovoyt was governor of the Kursk region before Andrei Smirnov, who was dismissed from office and soon after arrested. This all happened after the armed forces of Ukraine managed to enter this Russian region and for a prolonged period control the town of Sudzha and the surrounding area. It then became clear that the fortifications that were supposed to stop the advance of Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region had never been built, even though funds for this construction had been allocated from the federal budget. We've repeatedly discussed how strange it is that Russia, after years of full-scale war, failed to secure its own border with Ukraine. But it turns out, the funds earmarked for building fortifications on the Russian Federation's border with Ukraine did exist. They were simply siphoned off for the personal needs of officials in the Kursk regional administration. And I want you to have no doubt about it. A large portion of this money was going straight up to the Kremlin. This is how local government in Russia is built. If you want to get on the list of gubernatorial candidates, you have to pay. If you want Putin to select you from that list of candidates, you have to pay. And of course, you must share the profits from the region entrusted to you with the president of the Russian Federation himself and his subordinates. And the fortifications were no exception. No one in Moscow or in Kursk even thought that the armed forces of Ukraine might actually enter Russian territory. This is their political mindset. We can do whatever we want on Ukrainian territory, because in reality, it is ours. Everyone in Moscow understands that Ukraine is an artificial state, and even its own citizens supposedly know this and don't question it when we send troops onto their land or use missiles and drones to pacify them. But they will never dare step onto our territory. So why waste money on fortifications? It's better to spend it on the mansions of Kursk officials, or on Putin's palace in Gelendzhik, or other things the Russian president needs far more than some meaningless fortifications on the Russian-Ukrainian border. But when it became known that Ukrainian forces had entered Russian territory, and when an investigation began into the misuse of the funds allocated for fortifications, of course, inconvenient witnesses began to be eliminated. Andrei Smirnov didn't serve long as governor of the Kursk region. He spent almost his entire time as the deputy of Roman Starovoyt and may not have known the details of his boss's shady dealings with the presidential administration of Russia. However, according to sources in Russian investigative bodies, he could have provided crucial information that would allow them to detain the former governor of the Kursk region, Starovoyt, who by then had already become a minister in the federal Russian government, and place the blame on him for the failure to build the fortifications. But there was still one big problem left. What if Roman Starovoyt, during a court trial, began to reveal the involvement of federal officials in this scheme? And what if it became clear that the main culprit behind the failure to build fortifications on the Russian-Ukrainian border was not the administration of the Kursk region, but the presidential administration of Russia itself? That's how this simple mafia plan emerged. Arrest Smirnov, extract from him information about Starovoyt's involvement in the fortification fraud, and then either kill Starovoyt or drive him to suicide, making him the main scapegoat for the failed fortifications project. As for Smirnov, in exchange for his participation in this scheme to protect Colonel Putin, they would give him a relatively light sentence, which could even be cancelled later if the former Kursk governor took part in the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. And as we understand, nothing would happen to him there unless they decided to get rid of him during combat operations as well. But that would depend on whatever deal Andrei Smirnov could strike with the president of the Russian Federation and the other Kremlin mafiosi. For now, Putin simply got rid of the main and most important witness, the man he had previously rewarded with the post of Minister of Transport. Putin likely hoped that the failure to build fortifications on the Russian-Ukrainian border would not pose any real threat to the Kursk region. But when the Russian president's mistake became obvious, even to his own subordinates, he carried out a simple and brutal operation, eliminating the key player in the scheme and the main so-called culprit for the absence of fortifications in the Kursk region. Now all the consequences of the Kursk region's collapse will be pinned on him, portraying the situation as if he alone is to blame for the failure of the defense. This allows the federal authorities to shift responsibility for the strategic mistakes in planning and preparing the defensive lines, as well as to cover up the systemic corruption that has engulfed not only the region, but the entire power vertical. Thus, Starovoyt becomes a convenient scapegoat, blamed for the failure to build fortifications, the embezzlement of billions, and the very fact that Ukrainian forces broke through into the border areas. His death also conveniently closes the case, preventing the disclosure of details that could implicate higher-ranking figures in Moscow. In practice, this means that the investigation will be wrapped up quickly, declaring that all those responsible have been punished. The media and officials will push the narrative of Starovoyt's personal responsibility. The rest of those involved will either avoid punishment altogether or face only token reshuffles. Putin's regime and his mafia-style state deal with inconvenient people swiftly and ruthlessly. This is the essence of Putin's politics and the politics of the entire Russian state. Putin's regime poses a grave threat not only to Ukraine, but to the entire civilized world. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not merely a war for territories or spheres of influence. It is an attempt to destroy the international order built on the rule of law, respect for state sovereignty, and human rights. The annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbas, and the full-scale invasion in 2022 clearly demonstrate to the world that brute force and disregard for international law could become the new norm if not met with decisive resistance. This war has become a signal to other authoritarian regimes around the world, from China to Iran and North Korea. They are closely watching these events, assessing whether the West and democratic nations are capable of defending their values, or if they will allow dictatorial regimes to spread their influence unchecked. Today, Ukraine is fighting not only for its borders, but also for fundamental principles of freedom, democracy, and human rights. This is a battle between the democratic world and the forces of tyranny and chaos. That is why supporting Ukraine today is not only an act of solidarity, but also a strategic necessity for all free nations. Ukraine's victory is a chance to break not only Putin's regime, but also to draw a line against the global expansion of authoritarianism.